looking around for salvation. I've been looking around for the truth. All around me I see frustration, and I looked all over till I found you. I sit and listen to your stories, and you're telling me, please don't worry. There's a lot in this world you should know, and love in life is where you should go. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then love in life will guide you.
Goeienaand, good evening fellow South Africans and citizens of the world, and welcome especially to the growing Loving Life family. And I do apologize for the live stream yesterday. We had a huge bucket load of rain that came down overnight and I had no power. I was literally in the dark. I was stumbling around at 2:30 in the morning saying, what the heck's going on? First time in 20 years in Brisbane that I've been without power, but they got it back up within a few hours. So it wasn't a load shedding, it was just a good old technical issue with the power. All right, let's get on to the news first. Yesterday, Petrus Sifo started his walk of faith from East London to Pretoria. The walk of faith by Edward and Jarrett is approaching halfway as they leave Bloemfontein behind them and head for Cape Town. Every morning I talk to both of these groups to find out how things are going. So please, if you are awake that early, at 6 o'clock in the morning, I speak to Edward and Jarrett for about half an hour. And at 7:30 in the morning, I speak to Petrus on live. And please use lovinglifetv.com to watch live. All right, now, wow, talk about being sold a dummy. We were sold on the Rainbow Nation, promised by Mandela and the ANC. We all know what happened to that promise. Now we have everyone's heritage in South Africa being trashed by the corrupt, self-serving ANC leadership and their cadres. I put a video up about that yesterday, exclusively on lovinglifetv.com. So for those of you who are not registered to lovinglifetv.com, which is the platform which we are transitioning to, you're missing out on some great videos, which I could not put up on YouTube because of censorship. And that's a very important point. We have integrity in Loving Life, and that's why we put our videos up. That are too hot for YouTube to handle. That's why you have to go to lovinglifetv.com. So anyway, let's continue. What is the South African in a country where the third largest political group, the Economic Freedom Fighters under Julius Malema, are demanding that the white settlers leave and go back home? To answer these questions, I'm going to invite Dean Dart to give his perspective on what is a South African. Please remember to subscribe to be kept informed and ask questions you may have in the side chat. Please register on lovinglifetv.com, and because that is where this channel is moving to. Okay, let me get Dean on. Here we go, guys. Hi, Dean.
Hello, Scott.
Okay, I'm just waiting for your video to pop up.
There you go.
Oh, there it is. Perfect. Good to see you again.
Yes, lovely to pick up, hopefully from where we left off.
Now, Dean, you've had an absolutely fascinating and pretty traumatic life for so many reasons. And I'm talking about how you were treated by the University of Stellenbosch, how from a very early age you were adopted. Do you want to just briefly tell us about your life, just so people get to know a bit about you?
Well, I was born in 1994, and I'm currently 26 years old. I'm turning 27 in September. So I'm part of the generation which they have dubbed as the so-called born-free generation, although I can say that can perhaps be a bit disputed.
Right.
But I had moved a lot in South Africa. South Africa is a very big place, to say the least. It's a very beautiful place. I've lived... and I've moved all the way from the Eastern Transvaal all the way to Cape Town, and I can say that it's been quite a trek.
Yeah.
As they would say, it's the groot trek we Kaap to, you know.
You know what I like about you, Dean, is that you're like me. You don't take things lying down. You know what I mean?
No, you can't.
I like that in a person. Yeah, I've had my fair share of shit thrown at me by government as well. But anyway, please continue.
Well, in primary school, I was not in a fixed primary school. I'd been in several primary schools, and had experienced quite a breadth of inexperience of education in the primary education from in both public and in private institutions, and had started my high school career in Vredenburg, and fortunately, I had spent my whole high school career in one high school. Vredenburg is a small town on the west coast. It is sort of an industrial engineering town, which
Right.
is heavily based on the requirements of the industrial areas in and around the Saldanha ports, and the various installations which are there or used to be there in some respects, such as what has happened with Saldanha Steel that is shut down or is also furthermore being mothballed. But I completed my high school career in Vredenburg, and I served on the student, the RCL, which is the representative body of students or pupils in the high school from standard 7 all the way up until matric, which was it was fascinating, and I really enjoyed it very much. I was given a chance to be able to, shall I say, nurse into being a lot of the qualities which are required to be able to speak to people. I was also fortunate enough to go on the University of Free State. They had a leadership conference in Paarl, which I was fortunate enough to be invited to, myself and one other people who was with me in Standard 9. And that was the first time I had ever been to Paarl, which is the third oldest town in South Africa, and it's beautiful. I fell in love with it the moment I drove in, and as such, then after having finished high school, I developed an interest in journalism, and was working with some ex-journalists, and we at the time tried to establish a small local newspaper called the Snuffelgids, which was very interesting. And it was at that point in time when I started to gain a very large interest in, shall I say, in writing, more specifically, in being able to bring one's points across as eloquently as possible in terms of writing, which is a skill very different to being able to speak to people, especially when it's on a public forum. But then as time went on, I realized that wasn't feasible for me. So I, at the time, unfortunately, didn't apply at university yet. So instead, I went and decided to do something a bit more practical. And I went and I studied a diploma in financial management, or in accounting.
Right.
Which didn't exactly sustain my interest as well as I thought it would have at the time.
Okay.
And then, but in my time there, I was exposed to politics for the first time,
Right.
and it was in that town where I started to, shall I say, engage with various political groups, which are currently still on the scene. But obviously, I had visited the chief whip of the Drakenstein municipality, which at that time, and I believe still is, a DA-operated municipality. And I spoke to this gentleman, and he didn't quite find myself to fay with the DA politicking. So thereafter, I had contacted elements in the Freedom Front Plus, and was fortunate enough to have attended the Bosberaad, the Western Cape Conference in 2014, and I was fortunate enough to meet Dr. Corne Mulder, as well as various other more prominent and senior figures within the Western Cape caucus of the Freedom Front Plus at the time.
Have you met?
Which was equally.
Have you met Dr.
Mhm.
Peter Groenewald?
No, not before. No.
Okay. Well, he's a lovely man. Anyway, please continue.
Lovely. Yes. But at the time, I had also seen that the manner in which the Freedom Front Plus, I must say, this year is now 2014. So this is not a reflection upon what might now be the case.
Right.
But I saw how they were treating the youth inside of the movement. They were seeing the youth more as a trailer instead of the heartbeat of the party.
Right.
Which at the time I
had a problem
didn't feel
with.
too. Yes, I did, because the policies then that they were putting together were more in line with not the younger people who obviously are going to live with those policies for far longer than the people who had brought them up. And this is a policy issue, which is a problem in most governments in the world at this point in time. But I didn't, as I said, I didn't feel too comfortable with that. So then it was at that conference that they'd been speaking about this splinter type party, as they called it, which was Front National. And I had then contacted Front National and asked if they had a representative in the Drakenstein area. And I was fortunate enough to meet Daniel Litter. He's a prolific writer. He's written a number of books now, amongst which include some very interesting murder stories and serial killers in South African history, which is a fascinating part of South Africa's history.
Right.
But at the time, I was then asked if I was willing to serve on the executive then as the national youth leader in 2014, to which I said yes, I would, because I was finally able to find a manner in which I was able to serve, which is what I was really hoping to undertake. But I must also say there was one furrow as well before I started to go into politics, or actually during the same time. I'd become part of a group called Activate Change Drivers in South Africa, which was a program which was partially funded by Deutsche Bank and a number of other affiliates in South Africa, and their goal was to try and socially mobilize people who wanted to make change. And I was fortunate enough to have been nominated in the first intake, of 2014, and it was there that I also learned so much about activism. In actual fact, about activism and how to go about planning and organizing any activistic actions one would want to be able to take up.
Right.
But it was also at this time that I realized how politically fringe it was to be shall we say, a non-liberal Anglo-Kan, a non-liberal person of European descent, because I was surrounded
that's
by.
something we're going to be looking at in some detail very shortly. But just take us through to what happened at Stellenbosch University, because you were kicked out of Stellenbosch University, weren't you?
Yes, that's correct. So
What happened there?
in 2016, I had applied to the university, and I was fortunate enough to be accepted.
Yeah.
I started to study a BA in language and culture, hoping to go into teaching to do a diploma thereafter, and work with young people. I have a very deep love of working with young people, even though I might be one, but nonetheless, I really enjoyed it, and it was at the time I was then a 23-year-old amongst a whole bunch of first years inside of the BA faculty, which was quite interesting to say the least. But I was surrounded by young people who had very little intellectual defense, very little weerstand, like they would say, because ultimately, and what I had then started to notice, because I had taken various different electives, mostly focusing on language,
Right.
because I wanted to become a language teacher more specifically, because I realized that it didn't matter how deep or how great your ideas were, if you didn't have the vocabulary to be able to express it, it wouldn't matter what was going on in your own mind, in a manner of speaking. So I had seen, and I'll give you a brief example. You must remember that this was just after the crescendo of the Fees Must Fall campaign,
Right.
which
That
had
was
which had
by the
tarnished them.
EFF.
At that time, in Stellenbosch, I believe that was the case. Yes. At other universities, I believe it was more pluralistic. I know at Wits, definitely SASCO was heavily involved, and I know at UCT as well. It wasn't alone the EFF Student Command, but more specifically at Stellenbosch University, the EFF Student Command. And at that time, there was also the breakaway Blackland First, which themselves had also just established themselves.
Yeah.
And it was also during this year that, and this is what I was confronted with in the first 2 months at university, was that Blackland First, and more specifically, their Western Cape representative, Lindsay Marsdorp, had come to the university and was given the largest lecture hall in the BA faculty, and was allowed to come and spew the most racist, propagandist rhetoric that I'd ever heard. And now we must understand that this here was a massive lecture hall that was able to seat about 350 students, and it was packed. It was packed.
Wow.
There wasn't even space for students to sit on the steps. And it was allowed to transpire. If anything, it wasn't just that it was allowed to transpire, it was that it was
embraced,
not condemned by the university.
Embraced by the university. Now, something happened with you, because you set up the Anglo-Afrikaner Student Union, which was basically representing the cultures of the white people who went to the university, weren't you? What happened as a result of that?
Well, you see, my seeing what had been happening at the university, and seeing the lack of pushback from even groups that one would traditionally have considered to be quote unquote in one's corner, there was no pushback on the ground. We must understand what happens in courts rarely directly affects people on the ground. So court battles are very good, and they are a noble endeavor. But for students on the ground and normal practical people who have to face the day-to-day challenges that these courts are these court cases are supposed to face, so there was no pushback to things like this that I'd mentioned now with Lindsay Marsdorp, and I realized that I must also just say also some of the classes which transpire at our universities. To give you an idea, actually, I might still have this book here. There was a book that came out in 1995 called The Smell of Apples by, where is this?
Don't worry. Let's quickly run through the balance, because we need to get on our topic.
I see. All right. So it was in response to this that had been happening at the university, and I had seen that these young students had no capacity to be able to say no, this is wrong, because these ultimately your professors profess to you. They stand at the pulpit,
Right.
and from the perspective of these young people, one can see that there's no capacity to deny what's being said, because these are the academics, these are the people that know the truth. And so I'd seen a massive gulf in what I deem intellectual integrity.
Right.
And I had then decided that it was necessary to do something. And prior to my going to the university, it had always been a very strong dream of mine to myself being sort of a duplicity of a heritage, being both English and Afrikaans. I had.
So you're an Anglo-Afrikaner.
In my respect, I
Yeah,
believe that
okay.
that would be the case.
Yeah.
And I'd realized and I'd also seen at the university what a generative thing this was, where you had Afrikaans-speaking students and English-speaking students that were coming together and actually working together in harmony.
Yeah,
and
integrating.
Yes, in a healthy manner, because cultural backgrounds made it somewhat cohesive. And so I had attempted to establish the Anglo-Afrikaner Student Union, because there were no longer any student unions that were reflective of a politicking that was in favor of people of a Western heritage. The last one that had existed was the Afrikaner Studentenbond, which was closed down by Martinus van Schalkwyk in the 90s.
Right.
Kortbroek. And I had taken it upon myself to approach a few students, which I'd seen felt similar to and had seen some of the things that I was seeing. And so we established a small Telegram group, and we had got together a few students, and then from there we had jotted down several points that we wanted to be able to address. And so we had got together, and we came up with we had then denoted who was going to do what. And then we had one gentleman who had some good Photoshop skills, and he said, no, it's not a problem. He'll take it upon himself to design the materials that we would use to be able to invite students to our first inaugural meeting in May of that year. And so then in May, in the very early May, two of the members of the group had went and put up these posters. There were altogether 14 posters.
All over the university.
Of which, well, we only had so many. We had put them up in somewhat strategic locations.
Right.
In a bid to directly speak to students on campus, because
Dean, what was the university's response to these posters that you put up?
Well, you see, initially the student body. It was first the student body that had responded, because overall they were the first to see and experience these posters. So when they had seen this, they had created a massive uproar on social media, creating so much hype about it. And then a few academics had also become aware of this, particularly those that are more in the social justice circles. And in particular, one lecturer who was doing her PhD at UCT and was a lecturer at Stellenbosch University had seen that the gentleman who had photoshopped our posters had used a poster from the 1930s Germany, and had incorporated our symbolism into it, and had removed all Nazi symbology to be able to invite people who looked like those people on the posters. But I must say that there were also other posters which we'd put up, which were apparently not too controversial. But there was another poster which drew controversy. There was a man and a woman, and on the posters it said Anglo-Afrikaner student, fight for Stellenbosch, and there was an invitation and a date. And we had at the time denoted ourselves as the new right, if I can put it that way.
Right.
Only because there's a left on campus and there's nothing else.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that we were trying to be something that had existed before in South Africa. if I can put it that way, because a person must understand the posters in their totality, of course, to actually have understood the whole message, really, I
Right.
suppose you could say. And the third poster was a poster with Pepe the Frog,
Hmm.
and then a helicopter and the silhouette of Augustus Pinochet and a man falling out of the helicopter with the satirical quote saying, "Commies deserve a free ride," in reference to what Augustus Pinochet had done
Okay.
in
Yeah.
Chile. And they were to put it to you this way. One of the witnesses in the case, which I will get to now, but I just want to mention this. She, in her witness testimony, had stated that she did not know whether or not we had helicopters parked at Pittsburgh waiting to throw communists out of the helicopter. Anyway,
Jeez.
so the university was not very happy about this, because what we had done is that we had also arranged for the auditorium inside of the library, as many other groups in political orientation had done before.
Yeah.
And but I must also just mention this, that at the university there are things like the Black Management Forum. There's which was, I as a person could join it, but I would never be able to garner any of the benefits from it, because it's ultimately exclusive. You'd only have an observer
It's a
status, as it's called.
race-based organization. I get it. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And there were also other somewhat exclusionary organizations on campus, which were otherwise both allowed and in some cases even funded by the university itself.
And let's just cut to the chase here. If an organization like yours, which really talked to the white students, was allowed, that would be seen as racist, as opposed to all these black organizations which excluded the white community, basically.
Yes.
Now,
which was the majority on the campus.
Yeah. Now, just cutting to the chase here, because I want to get onto the subject. But because of what you did, all of a sudden you got the interest of news outlets like Al Jazeera, CNN, BBC, and Russia Today, who came scrambling around like flies around a carcass, because they saw, whoa, this is something we can talk about, because it's a white group excluding the rest of the community. Please just tell us briefly about that, and then what happened after that.
Well, if anything, I must say that what we had been attempting to do was to create an inclusive society that was including those of an English-speaking background and those of an Afrikaans-speaking background. So in as far as South Africa's history goes, I would say that there is a fairly inclusive society, considering the animosity which had otherwise been developed between the two groups over the years.
Right.
But in relation to the media storm that had otherwise transpired now, ultimately institutions like this are worried about their reputation. So there was an executive order which was taken by Professor Wim de Villiers. This is Section 8. It was a Section 8 executive order which had summarily suspended myself and two other co-accused, if I can call it that. And we were banned from being allowed to be on campus, and we were not allowed to, or I must say we were banned to protect us. So it makes you wonder what type of students they actually allow on into our campuses now.
Exactly.
But,
and I just need to add to that as a result of you were eventually expelled by the administration at Stellenbosch. As a result of that,
yes.
And having been named in the media, you were ostracized academically, socially, and economically, as you weren't able to secure employment. So because you stood up and spoke out for your community, this is what the university did to you. But Black Lives Matter and people like that are welcomed in there to go and put their racist rhetoric into the heads of young students. I find that an extraordinary bias. But there again, now Stellenbosch, you're not allowed to speak Afrikaans in the university.
Yes,
it's just crazy. Now, look, I've got a couple of questions I want to just put to you before we get on to our core subject.
Of course.
Being a member of the so-called Born Frees, being born after 1994, do you have any conception on how South Africa has changed since that so-called Liberation Day?
I will say this much. I know one thing is for sure, that I've been born into a world that no longer exists. The world that I was born into in 1994 and the world that it existed prior to 1994 is a world that I will never experience. It is a world that many young people will never experience. All we have, and or at least I can perhaps speak for myself more directly, all I have are intimations of the past. I only have figments, fragments of the past. When I walk through a place like Stellenbosch, I can see a figment of the past. But I have no concept truly of what it was like. I have no concept or either of either the good or the bad, I might add, in a manner of speaking. All I see is the momentum from the past, which is slowly but surely coming to an end.
It is, yeah.
That is the only that I mean. All I have are books and pictures to be able to have any clue as to what once was.
And old videos. Now, the Rainbow Nation that was promised to South Africa by Mandela clearly was just a pipe dream. I mean, they have that 1993 document where they spelled out how they were going to trample on the minority groups in South Africa. I'm talking about the ANC. Now, your vision is still, right now, your vision is about bringing unity between what you call the Anglo-Kaners and the Afrikaners. And you recently founded the Anglo-Afrikaner Union, or AU.
Yes.
Now, tell us about that, and then we're going to get into what is happening in South Africa, what is a South African, etc., etc. But please, tell us about that first, the Anglo-Afrikaner Union.
Well, the idea had originated already at the time that I had been at the university, and being a student at the time, it was apt to have taken the concept and have it applied it to students, precisely because there was no longer a student union that was representative. But now that I'm outside the institution, I feel that I'm able to move more broadly and be able to more accurately define what these things are out of the student context, out of Stellenbosch's context. So the union in South Africa, and I must say this is not the first time that this has been attempted, but the union between what I deem Anglo-Kaners and Afrikaners, I think it's this first apt to be able to define these things.
Right.
When we talk about these things, we're not talking about people who speak a particular tongue, because when I speak of a German person and I just hear them speaking German, that is referring to something other than the language itself. It is referring to a whole cultural tradition and history otherwise.
Right.
So in as far as we understand these terms, when I'm going to go into this, we must understand that if we look at something like the Zulu culture, for example, it is a culture that is ethnically bound. Or if we speak about the San or the Khoi traditions, these are traditions that are ethnically bound. At least the person is able to, shall I say, a person can be open to an understanding of it, but the truth is that a person can never truly have a deeply bound nature to it because of its ethnic roots. And so, working from this, when we speak about things like the Anglo-Kaner, for example, we're speaking about a cultural tradition which is slowly but surely coming to being, which is different to that of the Afrikaner tradition. Now, who precisely are these people? Now, when we speak about these cultures, we must understand them in terms of from where they come from, because the culture is downstream from ethnicity. Because the question that one can ask is that, can Western civilization exist without Western people? It's a very simple question.
Right.
Well, I will hope that the audience will perhaps ponder about that as we move forward in our discussion. So the Anglo-Afrikaner Union ultimately comes down to two groups of people who have become not so distinct from each other anymore. Because whenever I speak to English speakers of European descent, and I ask them, well, what is your culture? What does it mean to be an English-speaking white South African in South Africa? You will find massive cultural similarities in as much as everyday culture goes between the Anglo-Kaner and the Afrikaner.
Right.
They both enjoy, well, in as far as our culture has, I suppose, become quite shallow, they both enjoy rugby. They both enjoy the same music. They both enjoy some sports. They're both braai. They have similar delicacies, which has been transmuted between the two cultures over time, because these two cultures have been interacting for a very long time already at this point in time. So there has been a cultural intermingling which has happened, so much so that you have people with the surname of something like McLachlan but can't speak a word of English, for example. It shows you how deep this sort of integration between these two cultures has happened. Now, I'm not saying that these two cultures should intermingle. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm ultimately saying is that a union between the two, in as much as we are able to take care of one another, because no one else is truly able to otherwise identify no one else is able to identify that ethnic bond to such a heritage, and so to defend the heritage, it is necessary, to my view, that these two different groups can come together and start to work in symbiosis, in synergy with one another, so that they're actually able to address some of the serious and vivid problems which they mutually face together as a group in this place we call South Africa.
Right. Well, look, I tell you that I'm going back to the 1960s, and I went to boarding school. I went to a school called Michael House in KwaZulu-Natal. And without exception, out of 700 boys, they were all English background. And then you had Afrikaans private schools where, without exception, they were all Afrikaans. So there was still this divide happening at an educational level back then. The only time we actually met was on the rugby field. And if you were competing against, let's say, an Afrikaans school, wow, it was all on for
Sparks.
And the irony is, with reflection and now understanding history so much better, the irony is that back then, and I think you're right, I think it's changed now in South Africa, but back then there was this kind of contempt that the English whites felt for the Afrikaans whites, because they felt that they were dumber than them. And when you consider what the Afrikaners went through, the Boers went through, when you look at the Boer War, the way they have forgiven the English whites for the atrocities that the British did to their nature and their nation and their culture, it's quite extraordinary that, how they've actually embraced the English people. And when we look at the coalface of where there is still a bit of friction, and as you say, it's broken down a lot since back in the 1960s. But if you look at the coalface where there is still some friction, you've got like this small number of people in the Western Cape, the English whites, who still think for some reason they're superior. And it's about time they got off their shelf and just totally embraced the Afrikaans Boer population. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think you must understand that there is a perspective, which is a very fallible perspective, which Afrikaners have internalized, that if you are an English-speaking person of European descent, that means that you are a liberal. Well, I have looked into why this is the case before.
Yeah.
Now, you refer to the 1960s. Now, there were an exceptional amount of English-speaking people of European descent in South Africa, which were more of a liberal orientation. In some sense, adopting a a political narrative which was acting against their interests. And I'd never been able to understand why, because they had seen ultimately what was happening north of their border. It wasn't that people in South Africa, both English and Afrikaans, were not aware of what was happening in Portuguese Angola or in Portuguese Mozambique, or what was happening in northern Rhodesia, which later became Zambia, or what happened later in Rhodesia itself. It wasn't that people were not aware of this. So I had never been able to understand as to, well, why is it that such a large number of English-speaking peoples of European descent would act against their own interests so vividly.
Well, I can answer that question for you, because I grew up in the 1960s, and I basically know these people had an escape clause. Okay, the English Europeans, they had an escape clause. They had passports or descendants who came from the UK, came from France, came from wherever. If things turned pear-shaped, they could migrate back to Europe. Now that's where the difference lies. That's how they could afford to be liberals. Now you take that book that was written by my gosh, Alan Paton.
Patton, yes.
Yeah, Alan Paton.
Cry Beloved Country.
Yeah, Cry the Beloved Country. Now you know that his elderly wife, because Alan Patton's passed away, but his wife is living in the United Kingdom. Yes. She's not in South Africa, and this is what I'm talking about. A lot of these English whites have escaped back to the countries they came from, and they left the Afrikaners who for generations had been in South Africa, so they had no association anymore with Europe. They were stuck holding the baby. That's why a lot of, I believe, the English whites were so liberal, because they had that escape clause. Anyway, that's my thought.
I think it's a bit more deeper than that. I think that it must be well understood that the administration which was taken over by the National Party in 1948, the civil administration, was largely a British-based administration. Its structure was directly coupled to that of the British Empire. So what happened during that takeover and the Afrikaner integration into the civil service, and this is one very strong perspective which I have, is that they had created further animosity by, instead of allowing English speakers to actually serve in the civil service as they had been, they were instead forced out. It is somewhat of it's quite similar to what we may consider to be experiencing now, but it is intra-racial. So many English speakers which were serving in the civil service were replaced by Afrikaans speakers.
Oops, sorry guys, we've just got a little internet glitch. I'm sure it'll come back in a second or two. I hope you're finding this discussion interesting, and we're going to be getting more and more into this. If you are finding this topic and where we're going with this interesting, please type 1 in the side chat, and let's see how the reaction is. If you are feeling average about it, please type 2. Let's see how many 1s and 2s we get, guys. Okay, I'm going to just see if I can get back to Dean. Give me a second, because we seem to have completely stuck here. Okay, let's call him back. Okay, good to see overwhelmingly ones. That's great to see. Okay, we'll just keep trying. This happens. We've had this happen several times, and 99% of the time the guest does get back on. Unless, of course, there's been load shedding. That's a killer, isn't it? Oh, come on. Maybe the subject was too hot for the, yeah, whoever. Let me just send Dean a message. All right, let me just see what's happening in the side chat, guys. Well, I'm just waiting for Dean to get back to me. I've just asked him to Skype me. Okay, Be Positive says, what happened to your year-long Sina van Rensburg segment? Well, that's going to be coming back on lovinglifetv.com very shortly. We'll have a playlist which you can go to, and you can access all the Sina van Rensburg videos. There are about 35 of them. As you say, I did it over a year. It was one heck of a task. Dan Berryman says, at high school I had a fight every day almost. English-speaking, English school in Durban, but from the Transvaal with a very thick accent, called me Boertjie and was challenged every day. Well, Dan, that's one way that you certainly are put on the spot. Now, let me just have a look, see if we can get her back up to Dean. I have a horrible premonition that this is load shedding. Let's just see if he can resolve the issue. Okay, let's see what else has been said here. Darby said, we have left our children with no future by believing politicians. Now we're living in Denel time. We build a parallel economy so our kids can have a future they deserve. Well, one of the subjects we were going to be getting onto, which and I'm hoping we'll get our guest back on very shortly, was secession. And I see Michelle Mullards here, so this is a subject that Michelle loves to talk about. So yeah, we're talking about the move setting up a completely different state. Here we go. Hi, Dean. Hi, Dean.
Hello, Scott. Sorry, I had some signal shedding there.
That's not a problem. You're back. That's the main thing.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Hello? Scott?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Okay, let me just try again. I think it's okay, Marlena. We're just... Gotta love the South African internet. Yeah, Marlena, if you can give Dean a call and just ask him to Skype me again, tell him I could hear him, and just stay online. And here we go. Here he comes up. Hi, Dean.
Hi, Scott.
Okay, we seem to be back now. There you are. Now I see you. Much better. Was that just an internet glitch on your side, was it?
Some signal shedding, I suppose. Welcome
yeah.
to South Africa.
Welcome to South Africa.
My sincerest apologies about that.
No, that's quite okay. We had a bit of a chat with the side chat. And before we continue our conversation, please remember, guys, you got to register on lovinglifetv.com, okay? Now, getting back to you, Dean, we were talking about the Anglo-Afrikaner Union. We were talking about how, you know, the two white groups, if I can put it that way, the Afrikaans and the European English, seem to be bonding now, even though there are divisions in certain areas. But generally, they're by need, they have to work together. So tell us, what is a white South African, if I can put it that? What is a white South African today in South Africa?
A white South African, a person of European descent. I mean,
Yeah.
you see, first I think we need to look at what the term South Africa. Now, South Africa physically denotes a geographical location on a map. It's not actually a place's name when you really consider what the words mean. So it's very hard to, in some sense, I suppose it's very hard to derive one's identity from a point on a compass.
Yeah.
In a manner of speaking, firstly. So when we speak about a white South African, we're just speaking about someone who ultimately originated from a geographical place called South Africa. But I feel that there is a far too at least I believe people are slowly but surely realizing that that's far too a superficial manner in which to conduct one's identity. When we consider South Africa, it's not very old. South Africa, as it now stands, is what the Union was 111 years ago, versus other nations that have existed. I mean, for so much longer.
Thousands of years. Yeah.
Yeah. In some respects, there are cases where this is true, but in another respect, I feel that each culture that ultimately derives itself from another, from at least in this respect, ultimately derives itself from a culture which is a lot older. I mean, our history in South Africa didn't only start in 1652. At least in as far as people who consider themselves to be white South Africans. To my mind, I prefer to remember that we in Africa are fortunate enough to have both a fatherland and a motherland. We are beget from Europe, but yet we are born in Africa.
Right.
Africa being the mother, as is illustrated in many black cultures. They've understood this for some time. But whenever you hear people speak about Europe, you'll hear them often speak about the fatherland. For some odd reason, they would denote Europe more with the masculine figure, and Africa more with the feminine figure. So
yeah.
I feel that we are fortunate enough to find ourselves in a position where we have both parents, and in that we are going through our adolescence at this point in time, in as far as nations and nationhood is concerned, in as far as
I'll tell you what the irony is about what you were just saying with the fatherland and the motherland, is that you got people like Julius Malema from the Economic Freedom Fighters who's saying all whites must get the heck out of South Africa, and this fatherland being Europe is completely rejecting South Africans, despite their heritage being originally from Europe. They're basically not allowing them to come into the country. And part of that is because of the stigma of the old apartheid era. You can imagine how the liberal media would have a field day if the United Kingdom said, we will take in 100,000 whites who have been persecuted in South Africa. They would be having a field day with that. BBC, CNN, that they would be calling the UK government racist and all this sort of stuff, because they would immediately bring back to apartheid, which is where I think that this fatherland connection is misdirected, because it's rather like you were adopted. South Africa has now adopted the white population, but you've got one of the big political parties trying to say, you got to get out of here. So it's a very, very difficult situation, isn't it?
Well, we must remember that there's a big difference between the governments and their people. I will say this much, however, that every people does get the government they deserve. But as we are currently seeing in places like Europe, there are many people who are very unhappy with the manner in which the government is acting.
Yeah.
Many. I will say this much: that there are many young people in Europe, and of which I have otherwise come into contact with over the years in my mission to be able to create this union. Many young people my age, many of them are not liberal, not liberal at all. They've experienced the fruits of multiculturalism in their 20s.
It's a very bitter apple, isn't it?
Well, we must remember that eventually they are going to be the people in power as well.
Yeah.
We must remember that the youth eventually does take the reins.
Yeah.
So it is not that shall remain the status quo forever. We must not conflate the past with the future, in as much as, yes, it is true. Interesting enough, there's an interesting documentary called The Foreign Minister, which is based on Pik Botha's life. And in there, they go at length about how the international community was putting pressure on South Africa. But the people which were advocating for such things had no concept of multiculturalism. They themselves lived in homogeneous societies. And the majority of them had come to the understanding that, if there's no difference between the people inside of our own nation, then that means that's true of everyone. But up until you start to come into contact with differences, it's only then that they are illuminated, and only when you do come into contact with them are they almost shining bright, and you cannot not see it. So I understand what you mean when you say we must remember that the legacy, if we're going to talk about the media, the legacy media is unfortunately
the fake news.
Well, I'll say much of it is. Yes, much of it is related to.
It's propaganda. It's just propaganda they sprout out today.
Yes, from an elitist establishment.
Exactly.
Very much so. Yeah. Yes, from ivory towers, very very much so. So that what I'm trying to say is it doesn't reflect what the populace feels. So it doesn't. If something like that, we had such an incident in Australia not too long ago. I don't precisely remember which particular representative it was in the Australian House of Commons that had who was saying, well, we need to invite South African farmers to South Africa because they're being persecuted in their country. And that did create massive uproar inside of Australia. But we must remember that
was Peter Dutton.
I believe so. I'm
Peter
not sure
Dutton was the Minister for Home Affairs at the time. And Pauline Hanson from the One Nation Party totally agreed with him. But of course, the libtards in the parliament basically pushed him out of his portfolio because they said he was going to bring in a bunch of racists into Australia. It was just disgusting what happened.
It is always a projection in this respect that people refuse to acknowledge where their policies are leading their society to.
Well, I'll tell you the irony, Dean, and that is that here in Australia, we've got a huge South African population, especially in Perth. But let's get back to this. What is a South African? We've basically touched on what is a white South African, and we know that the two traditional, if we go back 100 years, combating groups are now becoming far more symbiotic. They're working together a lot better, and I think, as I said, that's because of a need. They've got to, because they've been persecuted by the ANC government. Let's talk about the wider concept of what is a South African. Tell us what is a South African when we look broadly.
Well, I think first we need to look at what is identity. I was invited to a talk in Khayelitsha. I was a speaker about 7 years ago, where I was actually asked to speak about this more specifically. And I had first said that it was necessary to first identify what it means to have an identity, especially because the question is, well, what is it? What is a South African identity?
Yeah.
Well, when we consider what an identity is, and we consider a nation, if you could imagine that if you could imagine that a person or uh, imagine the building of a house,
Yeah.
right? And there are parts of it which exist independently, but ultimately, when all put together, create
You're
the
all in
final
the
product.
same house. Yeah.
Well, more so that each person constitutes a part of the building of this house, in as
Right.
much as a nation is created.
Yep.
So, when a person considers one's foundational characteristics, which is the foundation of the house, when one considers the things that are immovable and unchangeable, although I will say that there are people who will disagree with this, in as far as much people believe that you can change your gender or change your sex or change your race, be transracial, for example, which is an unusual concept unto itself. But there are certain things which are immovable and unchangeable in terms of who you are as a person, and they are foundational characteristics. And naturally, if the foundation is broken, then anything you put on top of it will itself be compromised. And so when a person considers these primary identity characteristics, once these have been cemented, and generally this happens in our early, most formative years,
Right.
as individuals, right? So, but naturally, a nation doesn't just exist out of one piece of a foundation. It exists out of many larger parts, and all of these parts are integral to each other. If a portion of the foundation is cracked, then that impedes on any other portion that might otherwise be whole because of the nature of the foundation. But then we come to things like secondary characteristics, which I would identify as more or less the bricks. The bricks, and you've always seen how bricks are built together and are interwoven into each other. I mean, if we were to just and so it is necessary to be able to place these bricks in in an adequate manner that anything you otherwise put on top of it
Can be
will
supported.
retain its integrity.
Yeah.
100%. And so, but you see, we as people all exist out of these particular characteristics as well. And what a person ultimately is trying to create is cohesion. But now, of course, you can't just pack a whole bunch of bricks together and expect it to stand. Even if you had a solid foundation, what a person then needs, of course, is the mortar that fills in the spaces between the bricks and pulls the bricks to other bricks and pulls the bricks down to the foundation.
Right.
So you see, now these here are what I had considered tertiary characteristics. I will go into what these things are otherwise referring to in terms of identity. I just want to first explain the allegory,
Sure.
and then work from there. So all of these things together are then able to create a steadfast, strong wall. But what that means is that each part must be in its place, in a manner of speaking. Now, if each person was a segment of the wall, and we consider the entire nation, then we're talking about a very big wall. But that there is essentially, shall I say, that is essentially the structure of the particular society. Now, when one considers, I'd really express some of the more foundational aspects. Then we get into more secondary aspects, such as things that you. I must also include that there are things like familial relations, which are also somewhat primary in nature. If I have a brother, then I am someone's brother. I am if my father's sister has children, then they are my cousin. So I am my cousin. There are certain things which I'm not able to have any say in a manner of speaking. So the ability to be able to accept these things and to be able to work in the framework which is otherwise given to you will allow you to build into your secondary characteristics,
Right.
which are the bricks. These are essentially things which we, to some degree, have a choice in at least as we go higher up, because initially your first layer of bricks are very important, and very often in as far as society goes, our parents and us, and then as time goes on, as you start to build the wall higher, then society as well has a very big influence on the particular bricks which are otherwise then laid. The first few foundational bricks which are built upon the foundation are um, are things that we otherwise start to, shall I say, there are more things which are correlated directly to the foundation itself. Things such as entering into sports as a child, or being academically orientated, or to be more nature orientated, as more natural characteristics. But it's only upon the solid foundation that these characteristics can come into being. But as we start to build the wall, slowly but surely, we have a choice as to, well, okay, I want to put this brick on, or I want to put that brick on. And so these are where, as we get older and we start to enter into our adolescence, and we start to get something in our noggin, we start to identify with things outside and inside of ourselves mutually. So when we start, for example, if I identify as a communist, for example, then that will be a brick that I will have to put there. But if this brick is not correlated to more founding characteristics or lower bricks, then this will be a brick which will compromise the integrity of not only the bricks which I've laid, but any bricks which are to come, and furthermore, any other bricks which might be incorporated into that wall. So there's a weak spot in the wall.
Yeah.
And one thing is for sure, our enemies have been able to identify these weak spots and have been able to play away at it for a number of years. But that is
well,
point,
I want to pick up on something that you said there, because I believe that the education system in South Africa today, and in particular the universities, is radicalizing the black youth because of the way they're doing things. I mean, it's becoming a very
all youth, any youth that is coming into contact with our tertiary institutions is ultimately being radicalized, be it either to the left or to the right, in as far as the political spectrum denotes things.
But that's impacting the mortar, and that's really making the mortar cancerous. It's disintegrating, because for South Africans to work together, there needs to be a getting together, not a radicalization, which is happening in the mortar, as you call it.
I agree with you, but I find that it first requires oneself, because look, you have intra-racial relations, or inter-ethnic relations, and intra-ethnic relations. Now, the one has to do with how you navigate relations with your in-group. The other one has to do with how you navigate relations with your out-group. Now, if you have animosity to your own in-group, it is in fact then very hard to be able to deal in a healthy manner, in a manner that doesn't spoil the mortar with any out-group. And this is where the Anglo-Afrikaner Union, to my mind, is so important, is because if we cannot reconcile within our own group, how is it possible to deal with any group outside of our own group?
Yeah, cooperation is what you're talking about.
Cooperation, not just cooperation, but intra-reconciliation. I know a lot of people don't like that word, but because of the denotations that it has in respect to the new South Africa. But I'm not referring to it on those grounds. I'm referring to it on the fact that there are a number of very staunch people that feel, in as much as I'd mentioned about what happened in the civil service, for example, or what had happened in the Anglo-Boer War. But these things are past. They are things that are indirectly relevant.
Well, I think the white community today has got over it, and I think it's time the ANC government got over apartheid. Because if I take you as an example, you were born after 1994, so how can they point a finger at you and say, you were part of the apartheid stuff. You weren't. And a growing number of the white community have absolutely no knowledge of those days. You never saw a sign up outside a toilet that says only whites, did you?
Well, I will say this much: from what I've heard is happening outside the residencies inside of Stellenbosch, I will say that there are that students not being able to. Well, these are some of the complaints, of course, that I'm referring to, that was received
Right.
by the South African Human Rights Commission, where on those park benches they can't even speak the language which I say used to appear on this bench.
Afrikaans.
And
Yeah, they can't say who
yes, that is
it,
correct.
otherwise they're in big trouble. That is just
Yes.
absolutely ridiculous. Now
Absolutely.
let's move on a bit. What is the state, and what should its function be?
Well, it's very important to first make a distinction between the government and the state.
Right.
Well, the government is essentially, at least in as far as the democracy goes, in our context, a government is ultimately elected by democracy to determine how the state is governed. Hence, it is called the government. And we must make a very clear distinction between the two. However, what has happened in South Africa through cadre deployment, people have grown an animosity to the concept of the state, where people see the state not as something that is to serve the people, but rather as something which is serving the government and its cadre deployment / also elected officials, which are currently sitting in the government legislature.
Let me
So-
ask you this question, Dean. Do you think that this is because what happened in 1994 was you had a group of ANC leaders who put themselves in cozy ministerial positions, who have absolutely no understanding or capability to run, for example, the Minister of Health or the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Education. You know, they've got absolutely no capability of that, and that is why it's become such a mess.
Well, accountability must be held somewhere. Responsibility must be held somewhere, and we must never forget that there was a shared government agreement which the National Party had quit. They quit. So it wasn't the responsibility for the early years in particular, if I can call them that. I mean, I was 4 years old, 5 years old, and
Yeah.
when he just started to grow teeth. So, we must never forget that it wasn't just the ANC, it was the National Party. The National Party dictated the terms of the negotiations, and they were the ones that decided to leave the shared government.
Now that was
They
under
were the ones
F.W.
that-
de Klerk.
Mm-hmm.
Now F.W. de Klerk is seen by a growing number of people as a traitor. They believe that what he did to P.W. Botha, the way he took over the leadership of South Africa was all planned, and he was in the pockets of the Henry Kissingers and people like that from overseas. What are your thoughts on that?
It's more than that as well.
Tell us.
The Conservative Party, the KAPE, had decided to take part in both the referendum of 1992 and had decided to take part in the elections. Again, responsibility, we, as I had stated earlier, South Africa's history is quite a dynamic one. And as such, there are a duplicity of characters which have been involved in this slow state of collapse. And it's important to be able to acknowledge these other characters, such as, for example, what had happened in the Conservative Party, where they had turned around from saying no, they won't take part in the 1992 referendum, to okay, well, maybe we will now. And then furthermore, instead of staying away from the elections, as was otherwise agreed upon inside of the party, there was a decision made overnight, and then the next day they were taking part in the elections. the same thing had happened to some lesser degree with the Volksfront as well.
Yeah.
But now you see all of these characters are passing away. I mean, now we have Effie de Klerk that has cancer. I mean, all of these career politicians who had sold the country out, a country which I never saw, which I only saw figments of, and now experience only. I mean, the light which you see on my face is because of this momentum past.
Yeah.
I only have figments of that, but and it angers me to some degree when I see that the people that could have held these people responsible didn't.
Yeah.
But it's okay as well, because it puts a person into a position where you have to let that go.
Yeah.
It puts a person in a position where you have to reconcile with the past, because there's nothing that we can do about it. But history is a brilliant teacher in most of all what not to do. So, if anything, it's very important to look back at these things that have happened and to be able to realize that these are not the things that we should do.
Yeah. Now, I have to tell you, you've got wisdom way beyond your age. I like what you have to say, and you obviously have studied a lot. Now, one of the options that has been looked at very seriously, and I think it's probably the best option for, and I need to say here that I am absolutely colorblind, and I've got a lot of black friends on my Loving Life channel who live in South Africa. I've got a lot of colored friends. I actually wrote the book on the Griqua people back in 2007. I had it published. It's their history. And so I'm totally colorblind. But what really angers and pisses me off is the way that a group of terrorists, because let's face it, the ANC leadership were terrorists who are now destroying the country, are persecuting the minorities in South Africa. That's what pisses me off. Now, as I said, I've got quite a few. In fact, tomorrow morning I'm talking to a group of black Africans who are walking from East London to Pretoria, and
that's quite a check.
Yeah, it is. They want to meet Ramaphosa to talk to him about what's happening to the farmers. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I'm having a go at the ANC. It automatically becomes a racist issue, which it isn't. It's an issue of integrity, a lack of integrity within the ANC, and it's an issue that there are a lot of black Africans out there who completely get how corrupt the ANC are and would have nothing to do with them. So with that thought in mind, one of the options that people are looking at is the Western Cape seceding and becoming a totally independent state where basically people of any color would be welcomed in, but they would have to be culturally on the same lines. You don't want Julius Malema and his cohorts coming into an independent state like the Western Cape, because all they're going to do is cause chaos. So, with that rider, what is your thought about secession in the Western Cape? Is this the answer?
The Western Cape, in as far as so, if I can call it that, in as far as Kaapland, I suppose, goes, is the oldest part of the country. It is the most founded part of the country. We must not forget that there are many towns in South Africa that have not even reached 100 years old yet. South Africa, in terms of its urban infrastructure, by which I'm referring to its towns and cities, is very young. It's very, very young. So the Western Cape, and I mean this has also been declared in some of the audits which have been coming out, is by far the best run province of the country. and there are very good reasons for this, which we can go into if you so wish. But looking at a secession or self-determination, what does it mean to seek self-determination? What does it mean to want to freely associate oneself with individuals which you feel are more inclined to one's inclinations? You see, the Western Cape is being ruled by a national government that was never elected in that area. So naturally, there's a counter narrative going on, because ultimately we have a political party such as the DA, which is ultimately running against the ANC and is trying to show that it can run a better local government or provincial government in this respect than what the ANC can. Well, we need to consider that the Western Cape is, as I stated, one of the oldest places in South Africa, and much of the infrastructure that has been laid here, much of the systems which are otherwise put down in as far as foundational systems go, be it in terms of roads or be it in terms of dams or agriculture or any of those things, this had the most planning done out of any other part of the country, predominantly because it's been around for so long. So, it's important to when considering this, because a person needs to say, well, why is it different? No, it isn't just purely a matter of a government that is determining how a state to be run, because a lot of people have alluded to me that the Western Cape and how it's run in terms of its provincial administration is still very similar to what it was
way back.
Yeah, post apartheid.
Yeah.
And that much of those systems are still very much the same. And so, it's very hard for me to be able to drive a distinction between what the Western Cape was
and what it is
and
now.
what it is now.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's easy to say, well, look at what's happening in Limpopo or the Eastern Cape. Now, there, we need to be able to compare apples to apples. The Eastern Cape, for example, which is still under national administration, used to be very different to, pre-post apartheid. It used to be a very different place.
Is what you're saying, Dean, that the Western Cape lends itself to secession because it's like got the original government facilities. It's very well founded, and the problem I have personally with the Democratic Alliance is that their leader, John Steenhuisen, just a few weeks ago said that we would be very open to forming a coalition with the ANC under Ramaphosa. And what he was talking about there was a fracturing between the two sections of Ramaphosa and Ace Magashula. But he clearly said that...
Big fireworks.
Yeah, he clearly said that he would be very happy to form a coalition with the ANC, which to me makes the DA ANC light. And they need to be defeated in the Western Cape. I think that's the first barrier to secession.
You see, it's I know that last year, at the end of last year, when the DA had their Western Cape caucus meeting, words such as autonomy and decentralization were terms that did not exist inside of the Western Cape's DA caucus before.
Yeah.
So in as far as, because how one moves towards creating an independent state, how one crafts a state, is what comes into question. Now, but what we're talking about is essentially a divorce from the national government to essentially create a new national government within the Western Cape.
And that will never happen under a DA because they want to form a coalition with the ANC because the ANC would never have a piece of South Africa breaking off.
Well, they can't afford it. The ANC can physically, and the National Treasury cannot afford...
Well, the amount of taxes that come from the Cape, the Western Cape, is huge. Something like 600 billion rand or 800 billion rand a year.
yeah, it's otherwise the second largest income or tax generating province in the country. So, in as much as the books go, the Western Cape has the capacity to be able to stand on its own. But we must just take into account that that can only be such things can only be possible in as much as the national government is not able to stop it. Now, a lot of people had said that the National Party would rule into infinitum, and it was Jacob Zuma that had said that the ANC shall rule South Africa until Jesus comes.
Mm.
So we've heard these types of pronouncements be made before. The real question is that will people be willing? Because look, whether or not the Western Cape will or can become an independent country ultimately determines on the citizens that resides within its borders. There are various groups which are seeking means of secession, and many of these groups will hopefully be able to come together and pool their resources together in a bid to find a solution for a mutual principle. Because ultimately, when we are faced with disaster, which organization comes to the fore with the answer becomes somewhat moot, because ultimately it is an answer which numerous different groups are otherwise trying to find. We are seeing that there have been many different groups which have started to rise, both politically and metapolitically, and more civilly orientated, which are all advocating for secession or self-determination, but all of them sort of on their own means, on their own turf, in a manner of speaking. But as desperation creeps in, because we must remember that a lot of people are complaining about food prices right now, but we must remember that the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, the inflation has not yet affected the food prices in as much as it should. Because, I mean, when we've seen the amount of money which is being printed by the national government, especially during these times of COVID and eventual austerity, all of this money that has flooded the system is going to weaken the national government's stake in its ability to be able to financially uphold its own lot inside of the Western Cape. The question then is will the Western Cape government be willing to deintegrate itself from what the national government is willing to offer it?
Well, I can tell you the answer to that. I think that there's a growing number of people who are saying, we've had enough, we're gat vol with the ANC. And I know, for example, the Cape Exit group has something like 800,000 mandates. And it's basically halfway there to getting 50% plus one, which means that the provincial government has absolutely no choice but to actually have a referendum on independence by the Western Cape.
Well, they can still decide no, but how that will affect the ruling government's position is what will be very interesting to see. And I think,
well, they have no
particular,
choice. They have no choice. They have to accept it if over 50% of the population. In fact, there's a document that...
Who's going to organize this referendum then, you see?
Well, it's got to be done by the provincial governor. In other words, the current DA guy.
Yeah, and herein belies the problem. I mean, if the DA is a government of national unity...
Yeah, but they've got no choice. That legally, they've got no choice. If you get 50% plus one mandates people in the region saying, yes, we want a referendum, or we want independence.
Legally, Jacob Zuma should be in prison.
Oh, look, I hear what you're saying.
This is the state of the national affairs.
I hear what you're saying, but I think the ANC are so weakened. You look at the police service; it's a complete and utter joke, and it's getting worse day by day. You look at the South African
state, not the government. However, we must draw the distinction once more.
except you got Beke Cele, who I call the Shladi Motseneng of politics. But anyway, that's another story. But also the SANDF. What a joke. I mean, they're bankrupt. The whole country is bankrupt. They don't. If the Western Cape worked together as a community and said, "We're full, we've had enough. We're going to become an independent country," the South African National Defence Force wouldn't stand a chance because they are so disorganized.
It's not so much about. We must never forget Marikana. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, but look at the alternative. It's worse. I mean, they're actually bringing a genocide. This is the ANC. They're bringing a genocide on the entire country because the leadership is just looting everything out of the public purse.
That they have broken the fundamentals of the document which they agreed to uphold, and in some sense directly had a contribution in creating, then most definitely they have genocided the Constitution, if anything.
Well, a lot of people, including experts overseas, believe that they're orchestrating a genocide against the white minority population in South Africa. But you've got 10 different stages of a genocide, and they reckon that white South Africans are on level 8. And that's very close to level 9, where it starts being implemented.
Well, I will say this much. Currently, with our campaign that we are trying to launch at Stellenbosch University with the Afrikaans Sal Blyven campaign, I will say that in as far as many of the constituencies which I have come into contact with over the years, there has definitely been an uptake in cultural genocide. There has definitely been an uptake in the genocides of almost all people in South Africa, but that there is a venomous animosity towards Anglo-Conners and Afrikaners. You must remember when they come onto the farm, they don't ask which language do you speak. They don't ask, oh, did you vote for the DA? Oh, did you vote for the ANC? They don't. Things like that are not brought into question. It was very telling last year when there was a protest which was launched by people with or elements of the gender-based violence advocacy groups, and then the anti-farm murder groups, and eventually they all met at Parliament on the same day, and each group was vying for their own say, in a manner of speaking, and not coming to the conclusion that in actual fact the basis of the issue was violence. We live in a very violent country, and this country has become deeply desensitized to the violence that it implements in and among citizens, and then from the state itself. We must never forget what happened to Mr. Xhosa during the lockdown, and how the South African Defence Force brutalized that poor man.
Yeah, that was terrible. And he was just outside having a beer. And it's just ridiculous. And look, we need to make it clear to everybody watching that we aren't suggesting that it's just the minority white population that are being persecuted. It goes across the board. But having said that, I had Neil de Beer on live about a week ago, just over a week ago. And he said, Scott, he said, during this lockdown, you should go into the townships and see what's happening. There's no lockdown there. And there can't be a lockdown. And he's right, there can't be a lockdown. You've got 15 people living in a tiny little hut. They're carrying on as if there was no lockdown. This is why this, whatever it is creating so many positive cases in South Africa. I'm not even going to go there because the YouTube Thought Police watch this channel like the Gestapo. So
welcome back. I knew you were just banned for quite some time. Welcome back, by the way.
Thank you. Well, that was a surprise, I have to tell you. It's very interesting because they took down Loving Life on the 17th of March. I remember the date exactly. 17th of March, they took it down because they said that it was going against community standards.
Mm.
And 2 weeks later, I was sitting here in front of my computer, and all of a sudden, my Loving Life channel popped back up again on YouTube, because I was actually using Gmail, and you know, I had a couple of windows open, and bang, it just suddenly up. I said, what the heck is this? And I went and checked,
Grace
and it
from
was
the
back.
big tech gods.
I
Grace
think
from the
someone's
big tech
fat
gods,
finger
yeah.
hit the wrong square or the wrong space. I think that's what happened.
Well,
So
if anything, I'm very grateful.
we're living on borrowed time, is what I'm saying, because someone's fat finger will probably land up on that little block again, and it'll just disappear again. Which is why we've got LovingLifeTV.com, which is where we are now encouraging everybody, and everybody who's listening here, please make sure you go to LovingLifeTV.com. You can see the website address below the image that's on your screen. Register there. That is where we are transitioning to. Now, tell me about your current projects that you're involved in, Dean.
Well, I mean, besides the Anglo-Afrikaner Union, which if would you mind if I perhaps just expand ever so slightly on that, and that I can
please,
then
go ahead.
move on to. So the Anglo-Afrikaner Union and its need to bring together these two different groups. I must say that one of the most difficult things is that see, in South Africa we have two very stubborn peoples which met each other here. You see,
Yeah.
and we have the Anglo-Kaner, the English-speaking South African, which has a very different perspective in a manner of speaking in life, in as much as the British do, and the Afrikaner has a different perspective in as much as the Germans do.
And I must
And
add
so
to that,
there's
Dean,
this-
that the Boers
Yes.
have a different perspective to the Afrikaners. You've actually got three groups, because the Boers,
Well,
yeah, carry on.
here we come down to well, I mean, I would suspect. I mean, look. On the one hand, we have the word Boer, which refers to an occupation, all right. But not only does it refer to an occupation, but it also refers to a particular people which existed in particular republics, which had existed for a fifth of South Africa's history in its totality.
Well, I have
so
to tell
it
you,
is-
there are a lot of people who I know through this channel who see
Yes.
themselves as Boers
this is
today.
very true.
today.
But what does it mean to then be a Boer?
I think
be
it's a
Boer-
cultural thing. I think it's, you know, their values.
I would say it's more of a regional identity. I
Yes.
don't know if it's possible to be a Boer and come from Cape Town at the same time,
Yeah.
in a manner of speaking, unless I was perhaps a farmer.
Well, let
don't
me
know,
ask.
you
Let
know?
me ask a couple of Boers, guys. Just tell us what are the ingredients that make someone a Boer. I'm sure we got a few Boers in the side chat here, so we can just get their comments on that. Yeah, please go ahead.
So the question then that I suppose also comes up is that, well, what is the distinction that otherwise can be derived from between an Afrikaner and a Boer? Now, this year, to my mind, has been used as a device to create division in and amongst the Afrikaans-speaking population for a very long time. This is
Okay.
my perspective, at
Yeah,
least.
go ahead. Let's hear it.
Because you see, it's a lot easier, because if you then create and ultimately this derives back to the Anglo-Boer War in a lot of ways, where they say no, but the Afrikaner had funded and became rich off the Anglo soldiers which were in South Africa at the time, and needed to derive from somewhere their means of food and wine and wagons and horses and the whole like. And there were families in the Western Cape that became very, very wealthy out of these particular exchanges.
Right.
And so people feel, at least in as far as some Boers which I've spoken to myself, or self-identified Boers who don't farm, but consider themselves to be Boers,
Yeah.
because they come from a lineage of people who ultimately helped found the Boer republics. But we must ever remember that ultimately we all came from Cape Town, in a manner of
Yeah.
speaking, in as far as Volksplanting goes, which is the 6th of April, 1652, which is this day, I might add. So
Yeah,
it's
it
quite a
is, isn't
symbolic day, yes, in and of itself.
Wow, look
And
at
to my
that.
mind, I hope we would be able to plant a nieuwe volksideologie, if I can put it that way.
Yeah,
A new manner of being able to. I personally feel that it is a good thing to be able to have a regional identity, because in some sense, I mean, myself having been born in Pretoria, I know very vaguely some of my own background, and as far as my personal genes goes, and you know, I know that on one hand I come from sort of like a Strydom family, right? But uh, I and so I come from that area. So if I were to say that I identify as a Boer, I don't know if that would be accurate. I don't know. I don't know if that there again. You see, this is those bricks. This is something I suppose,
yeah,
both. You know, it's sort of one of those low-lying bricks in the wall, where it's, you know, uh, you are partially that, but also not partially that. I mean, you must remember that as time has moved on, I mean, in 2038, it's going to be, let's see, it's going to be the 200th year of the Groot Trek. Then it's going to be the 350 year of the French Huguenots that landed, and it's going to be the 500. Is it the? It's either the five. It's
well,
going to be the
it's
550th year since Bartholomew Diaz had landed in South Africa.
right.
So as time goes on, these things change. Their meaning also changes. You see, in a manner of speaking, when we consider um, things such as identity and the things that makes it up. I mean, a very good example is Volksspiele, which is traditional Boere or Afrikaner dance. I don't know, you know, depending on who you're going to speak to, they're going to have two different interpretations on this in a manner.
Yeah.
But again, I find this to be a very divisive thing, personally.
Well,
And
I
I
find
feel,
it. I'll tell you what Rudy says in the side chat. He says, "Ek is 'n boer, maar hier is te min plek om te skryf wat 'n boer is." Now, I'm just saying that. But I have to tell you, Rudy's a lovely guy. He's, you know,
yes,
you could say he's an Afrikaner, but he's in his heart he's a Boer. And just talking about that, Dean,
mm,
I have lived in Australia now for 30 years.
mm,
When I left South Africa, it was back in 1986. So it's actually longer than I think it's about 30. No, it's about close to 30. Yeah, about 30 years. But when I
mm,
fly to South Africa and I go over the
mm.
coast of Africa, it's almost like I can feel my spirit just being embraced back
Back in the
into,
motherland.
yeah, back absolutely. And I would
Yes.
love to come back to South Africa one day, if, for example, the Western Cape secedes, because you know that's where I'd feel comfortable in going back for a holiday. But I couldn't go back to South Africa today because, you know, the memories I have of the old South Africa, they would be destroyed, you know, with the mess that the country is in now, and I prefer to keep those memories.
Yeah, I've heard many people say they're very similar things
Yeah,
to that effect, who also feel very much the same, where they would rather, um, you know, the past is a very strong narcotic.
it
You
is.
know,
It is.
it can also keep people from actually dealing with what is happening, I might add.
Yeah.
And so I've spoken to many people that cling very heavily in the past, and it's rightfully so in some respect, because man, anyone who's just seen what Joburg looks like now will understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's shocking.
So,
I remember the Carlton Centre. We used to go up to
mm,
the 50th floor, I think it was, and they had this piano room where they used to, you know, you'd get a drink, and it's slowly at the top, it'd move around, and you know, you'd get a window seat and you'd look over Johannesburg, and it was just
yeah,
absolutely incredible.
Yes, I can't begin to fathom. I can't.
It was
I
absolutely
can't
amazing.
begin to fathom.
And there was a guy playing on the piano, you know, as
Mm,
you just sat there and chatted. And oh, you know, that those are the sort of memories that I want to keep. Because
mm.
when I was there in 2007 and I wanted to go to see the Carlton Centre, they had all these big gates up and you couldn't get in. It was all locked up. The whole building was, you know, it had been basically closed down. It was so sad.
I'm very sorry to hear that such memories are so easily shattered
Oh, they are.
by
Absolutely.
such. Oh, it's. Uh, but if I may, if well, on this note, then I'm hoping that one of my other projects, including this one, might be able to put you in a
Please tell us
position
what
to
it
create
is.
new memories.
Okay.
So the other project which I'm otherwise engaged in is starting a non-profit company which is called the Rates Institute,
Right.
which is whose patriarch is Francois Willem Rates, uh, which we have a biography. We do have a website, but it's still under construction. I've been working
How
hard at
do
trying to
people
finish it, but it's
contact you?
taking some time.
How do people contact you if
Well,
they want to get in touch with the other organization?
we do have a website, and I can otherwise supply an email address, and we also have a small PR firm, um, which is part of another thing which I'll get into, which they can also otherwise contact.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, how about you give us the
so
email address and people can email you?
uh, sure. For the Anglo-Afrikaner Union, anyone who might be interested in that,
Yeah.
I can. Okay, so it's Anglo-Afrikaner at of
Anglo,
Aapstertjie.
hang on. Afrikaner. Is that KANER, one A? Anglo
Yes, that's
Afrikaner.
correct.
Yeah, okay. At, yeah.
Yes, Anglo-Afrikaner at Tutanota.
How do you spell
That
that?
is TUTANOTA
Yeah, yeah.
.com.
Okay. I'll just repeat that to you. It's Anglo Afrikaner with a K and an A in Afrikaner,
Mm-hmm.
at TUTANOTA.com.
That's correct.
Okay. I'm just going to
Otherwise,
drop that
then
into the
anyone.
side chat.
Okay.
So
Otherwise,
people
we
can,
also do have a Telegram channel through which they can otherwise contact us on.
right.
That there would be T/ME/Anglo-Afrikaner Union.
Okay. All right.
That there takes a person to our Telegram chat. We also are on Facebook. We want to be able to move into alt tech, but you will see there was a short release which we made in this respect, where a lot of Anglo-Afrikaners and Afrikaners are still are on the big tech sites, and so for us to be able to adequately be able to disseminate our message, we have also found it necessary to be able to be on big tech, as much as a person might not
Yeah. Well, we're getting.
agree with it. But I also see that you yourself are also trying to work towards
Yeah, we're getting off big tech.
self sustainability.
Yeah. Yeah. You've got to.
It's
I mean, it's
yes,
a
most
simple case of integrity, because if I say something which is my truth, because it doesn't fit with the snowflakes at YouTube, they give me a community strike, and then they say, you know, you're breaching community standards. And look, I'm not going to go there. It's a long story, but I've been having a battle with YouTube for years, and I'm absolutely delighted that we now have our own channel called livinglifetv.com. Now, I have a proposition to put to you, Dean, because I think that you could certainly add value with your perspective on things that are actually happening in South Africa. Now, this is totally up to you, but would you like to produce a weekly video on your perspective of current news exclusively for our new platform, lovinglifetv.com? So it'd just be a once a week video, maybe on a Friday we'd put it up or whatever, where you put up your perspective on what's happening in South Africa, bringing in your areas of interest, which is obviously identity and stuff like that.
more reading. You know,
I mean, 10
I
or
would
15
definitely.
minutes.
I would definitely be in consideration of that. I just I just don't. I don't know. Will I? I don't know if I'll need to do any production. I've never really.
All
I
you'd
mean,
have
I've
to
never
do is
really.
just all you'd have to do is just give us a video where you're talking about a particular topic, and we would then put it
Okay.
up on the website.
Yes, because this year sort of dovetails into what we're trying to do at the Rate Institute now.
Yeah.
The Rate Institute now. This is actually something which has been coming since 2016. It initially started quite informally, but as time moved on and started to realize that it required more formalization. Now, the Race Institute is basically a policy-making, law innovation think tank. This focuses on organic, statecraft, natural law, and intergenerational policy considerations. Largely speaking, we're trying to bring in young people, but we are very open to people who have experience, because ultimately, when it comes to things like answering the issues that the West.
Oops, we seem to have hit another little issue here. All right, guys, let me have a look at the side chat. What's happening? Francesca says, Ek is trots op my native language, Afrikaans taal. I value my culture and the culture I was born into. I don't think it will go away. My culture sal altyd 'n part van my lewe wees. Well, that's fantastic. I mean, that's a freedom that we should all be able to share. Okay, I think we've lost Dean again. I'm just going to try and get him back on. We're just wrapping up this live stream anyway, so we certainly had a lot of what he had to say. How did you guys find that live stream? You know, the discussion. If you liked the discussion and the subjects we covered, please press 1. If you were pretty well, you didn't like it as much, please press 2. Let's have a look at the side chat. And don't forget, tomorrow night we have another live stream at 8 p.m. Johannesburg time. In fact, Marlene is giving me a lot of work. Marlene is giving me a lot of work. Look at her. There she says, what about Dean does a once per month update live? Okay, I think we've lost Dean. Yeah, I think we've lost Dean. All right, cool. So look, I'll pursue Dean with a suggestion of having a once a week or perhaps once every 2 weeks a video that will go up exclusively on lovinglifetv.com related to this whole subject of identity and the people of South Africa. I think it's a really underrated, under-discussed topic which needs to be flushed out. Okay, guys, I'm going to wrap up the live stream now. I want to thank our guest in his absence. Clearly, he's got another internet issue. And yeah, thank you to the moderators for keeping the live stream safe. And have a great evening, guys. And I'll see you tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Johannesburg time. And for those who are new to the channel, please make sure you register at lovinglifetv.com. There you are. There's the address right there. lovinglifetv.com. I'll leave the side chat open for a couple of minutes, guys, so you can say your goodbyes and take care. Bye for now.